If you're looking for a getaway this winter for rejuvenation and transformation, join Psychedelics today for our Vital retreat at Blue Osa in Costa Rica. Blue Osa is an eco-resort that's all about harmony with nature. It's nestled between the jungle and the beach and primarily runs on solar power. And included in your Vital journey are 8 days and 7 nights accommodation, 4 transpersonal breathwork sessions, 2 as a breather and 2 as a sitter, 3 farm-to-table meals per day, and you'll also receive a $50 gift certificate for the on-site Blue Osa spa so you can indulge in some relaxation. Spend your free time taking a dip in the natural pool, exploring miles of secluded jungle beaches, and experience guided birdwatching hikes at sunrise. Stay active with daily yoga, intuitive movement, and CrossFit practices to keep your body and mind in sync. There's also free Wi-Fi if you wish to stay connected. Your group airport transportation is also included, making it a hassle-free adventure. So if you're ready to reconnect with nature, yourself, and other like-minded healers and professionals, join us this January 6th through 13th, 2024. Visit psychedelicstoday.com/events and scroll down to the Costa Rica retreat page for more info.
Every year, psychedelics are becoming more accepted into mainstream culture, and people all over the world are asking themselves, how can I get the skills, foundations, and tools to build a meaningful career in psychedelics? Well, that is exactly where Vital comes in. Our 12-month interdisciplinary practitioner training program is robust, inclusive, and most of all transformative, both personally and professionally. Our graduates have gone on to do many different things in the psychedelic space, like working at ketamine clinics, consulting on clinical trials, opening a retreat center, starting their own coaching or wellness practice, and even launching a psychedelic media and merchandise platform, and so much more. Classes start January 23rd, and our application deadline is December the 20th. But if you apply and enroll before November the 19th, you'll save $750 from tuition. Head to vitalpsychedelictraining.com to download our full course curriculum. You can also check out our events page at psychedelictoday.com to sign up for an upcoming Q&A session or to join an expert-led topical taster webinar. Find out whether Vital is the transformative journey you've been looking for.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Joe Moore here. We are joined by Dr. Dave Rabin of Apollo Neuro. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. Appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, excited to. And I think we chatted maybe, could be like 6 to 12 months ago. I had a really compelling chat. I was excited about everything you're up to, your background, how you're grounding everything you're doing, and pretty interesting science. And yeah, somehow that's not really always the case in psychedelia. But, you know, what are you going to do? Anyway, before we dig in, I'd like to learn a bit about you and how you kind of got into this space around neuroscience, psychedelics, things like that. And, you know, to the point where you wanted to develop a device like this.
Sure. Well, it started for me as I've been studying, you know, I'm a psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, and I've been studying chronic stress for the better part of 20 years. I've always been interested in consciousness and the way the brain works since I was a little kid, when I used to have really vivid dreams that no one was ever really able to effectively explain anything about them to me, and why they felt so real. But that always fascinated me. And I started from a very young age because of that to question just what the word real really means, because, you know, there's so many different takes on it. And I always wanted to study dreams and consciousness, but as I started to go through my training and learn about neuroscience research and what was possible for us to do work in and research in, a lot of my mentors really discouraged me from studying this area because it was so underfunded, and so there was so little known that I ended up focusing on chronic stress and how stress changes the way we interpret meaning from the world, and how some of us are exposed to stress and use it as an opportunity for growth and discovery and expansion of ourselves, and others of us get exposed to stress and get sick, right? And so, you know, for me, I was always fascinated by what separates folks who fall into one camp versus the other, and why do some people end up falling into both? And then as I was finishing my medical training in 2012, I had a very good friend. I was studying chronic stress on a neural stem cell level related to dementia and disorders of aging. And I was still at that point, I knew I wanted to continue neuroscience work, but I wasn't sure what medical specialty I wanted to focus on. And one of my best friends at the time, who knew she wanted to be a psychiatrist forever, kept telling me, Dave, you should really become a psychiatrist. You'd be a great psychiatrist. And I was like, nah, whatever. I don't, doesn't really interest me. But I had also had great experiences training in the psychiatry department, and I love the people I worked with. And but the practice of it was so drug focused, and it was so much not getting to the heart of what was really causing suffering in people, and that was a bit discouraging. And so I told her that, and later that day she sent me like an email with 10 or 12 of the leading publications that had come out in the psychedelic space around treatment resistant mental illness, and how this was starting to shift the paradigm of the way we were seeing mental health and treating mental health disorders. And it just totally enthralled me, and I was just fascinated by this work that was now at that time being published in world-class scientific journals. And I within 36 hours of reading those papers, I made the decision, I'm going to become a psychiatrist. I'm going to focus on studying what I've always wanted to study, which is consciousness and healing from this perspective.
That's super interesting. And I guess, it tracks, right? Like, do we really, if it's avoidable, do we really want somebody on a med long term? Like, I think, the answer is no. We want them on natural things, or, one super aggressive intervention and back to normal, or wearables. So he kind of hit all three, which is great. I'm kind of curious, like, what kind of stuff at the time in 2012 was kind of overly drug focused in psychiatry? Was it like the typical kind of antipsychotics and SSRIs, and that's like the only tool being used, or how did you see it?
Well, I think at that time, a lot, biological psychiatry was in its heyday. There was a lot of talk, and the general narrative around psychiatry was very much that people had a genetic deficiency in functioning of their serotonin receptors or functioning of their dopamine receptors. And there were these imbalances in our neurotransmitter systems that we were born with that resulted in us developing mental illness. But that really left out a lot of the environmental story and the story about what happens to us that causes us to develop mental illness, because not everybody gets it, even if you have a genetic predisposition. And so the story just seemed very incomplete. And when I started to study and I was spending more time actually treating patients with mental illness, from depression, anxiety to PTSD, schizophrenia, and other bipolar psychotic disorders, the whole spectrum, I realized, which is not something that's unique to me, I think a lot of us see this in the field, which is that a lot of our medications are really focused on symptom management and kind of sedating or numbing people to their feelings to help them cope with day-to-day stress, which has its place. And there are times where we need to stabilize people in that way. That's absolutely a reality. And those medicines do have their place. At the same time, the long-term use of those medications causes a lot of very unpleasant side effects that often accumulate over time and get worse, which results in people not wanting to take the medicines and results in relapse, illness relapse, and things like that. And it just didn't seem like we had good answers to get to the root of what was going on. It was like we were just scratching the surface and trying to, get a sense of the symptom patterns, but we weren't actually looking at what is lying underneath the surface about why people might have a lot of these different symptoms. And then I started to study trauma, and through chronic stress, I realized, and the study of trauma and some of the work that started to come out of Tom Insel's focus at the NIMH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, which was called RDoC at the time, which is research domain criteria. And you don't need to really know much about that, but it was a very interesting project to look at the commonalities between all mental illnesses and what is at the core from the evidence. And what that started to point to was trauma, and that traumatic experiences where we are not supported afterwards, or worst case, where we're actually blamed for the trauma, has a way of manifesting itself in all of these different psychiatric conditions, from depression to anxiety to ADHD, to PTSD, and even schizophrenia. And our schizophrenic patients had all had, for the most part, traumatic backgrounds, which was really interesting to me. And so trauma and chronic stress really kind of came together as this primary theme underlying what was, to me, seemed to be at the root of a lot of our mental illness, that we were trying to treat, and that our patients were struggling with. And so that became an increasing focus of a lot of my research, which of course led me to, start to evaluate what works really well for trauma in that time, and what was starting to come out in the psychedelic literature around MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD and psilocybin therapy for depression and end of life, and the work of people like Roland Griffiths and MAPS, and there was just so much interesting stuff coming out that was giving us a different concept of how to think about mental illness that was very, very different from what we were taught in medical school and psychiatry training. And so all of that together started to form a new basis for how we're now thinking about mental illness.
I love that, and thank you so much. Like, what I get concerned about the psychedelic space being so anti-psychiatry, but psychiatry has a bit of an uphill battle, right? Like in a lot of ways, right? Like how you just laid that out was incredible. I did some reading on what was the book, Saving Normal, where they kind of critique the creation of DSM-5 by, I think the guy who was the chair of the project. And, stuff wasn't always scientific in there, but the way you're speaking about a super scientific approach to understanding these things further, and traumatic experiences, perhaps precipitating things like schizophrenia. Like, we all thought that was genetic or something, inherited, perhaps inherited a little bit, but perhaps not through genetics and as such, right? So
yeah, well, and now we have. Oh, you're welcome. And now we have the epigenetic story as well. That's really interesting, right? So there's the the genetic predisposition, which is our DNA code that has been passed down from our parents, which is the code that's the same in every single cell of our entire bodies, except our sperm and egg cells. That is 50% from mom and 50% from dad, roughly, and that code is effectively like our biological map of our bodies. And then yet, even though every cell has the same DNA in it, certain cells know to be skin and certain ones know to be brain. And the reason that they know is because there is another layer of code on the DNA, which is called epigenetic code, that tells certain parts of the DNA, hey, we're skin, turn up skin proteins, and turn down brain proteins. And then there's other ones in the brain that say, hey, we're brain, turn up brain proteins and turn down skin proteins, right? In a very simple way. And so that also passes down a predisposition, meaning a certain percentage likelihood of developing a certain illness. But I think that what we're learning now that's really fascinating is that there's by no means a guarantee that because you were born with a certain predisposition to a particular mental health illness, that's your destiny. Right? It doesn't mean you're stuck and that's what's going to happen to you. It means that, maybe we need to be extra careful because there's certain stresses or certain things that could happen to you that could result in this. And so we need to take more care around how you're dealing with stress, or how safe your environment is and things like that, and how you're supported after a traumatic event, because that could ultimately set the stage for what unfolds later, that either becomes a growth opportunity or becomes an illness opportunity.
Yeah, I love that, and I loved your description of this protein. Now that was my shower thought this morning. Actually, I was digging into how does malnutrition impact this? It's interesting. I'm sure there's plenty of data on that. Anyway, so you had somebody kind of sending you this psychedelic literature, and obviously you're in this field, so you're like, okay, we should pay attention. This, it's Hopkins or whatever other school is doing this good work. Like, were you kind of nervous to dig in, given like the reputational pressures that can happen in medicine? Like, it's always edgy to talk about something a little new, right?
For sure. But again, going back to 2012, psychiatry was in and of itself a pretty, like, it was a looked down upon field in medicine. Like, even if you were in many other fields of medicine that have more objective measures of illness, looked down at psychiatry saying, oh, well, you're just guessing because you're providing treatment based on symptom patterns. You're not actually understanding the core of what's going on. You don't have tests, you don't have lab tests, you don't have antibiotics, you don't have tools that actually get to the heart of what's going on. So it's just like a guessing game. And I think that the stigma of becoming a psychiatrist actually overwhelmed the stigma of psychedelic research. And I think there were, which is kind of funny. I think there was other challenges once I became a psychiatrist to fold in the psychedelic work. But psychiatrists on the whole, in general, are actually a very open-minded bunch. And, it's hard to deny that we are struggling as a field to address the growing burden of mental illness. I mean, look at the statistics, right? You can't deny it. And so, from that standpoint, psychiatry actually, once I made the decision to become a psychiatrist, it was actually a pretty easy decision to study psychedelic medicines and to study technology and alternative treatment modalities, because there was an agreement in the field that we need more, better, less side effect burdensome techniques to treat some of these hard to treat illnesses. And so ultimately down the road, that led me to study wearable technology, because I was trying to figure out, well, psychedelic medicines are hard to access. They're expensive. They require highly trained therapists to deliver in the Western model. And so how do we actually understand what they're doing, right? If we understand that trauma is unprocessed trauma, that where we weren't supported effectively is at the heart of, or could be at the heart of, why people get and develop mental illness that doesn't get better, then, the question became, well, how do psychedelics work, right? Because when you look at the psychedelic medicine studies, whether they're in animal models or in humans, the results are really profound and very different than what we see in Western medical treatment. People, just as one example, right? One of my favorite examples is the phase 2 MDMA trial with MAPS that has now looked at 1-year follow-up data. And these are people who had on average 17.6 years of treatment-resistant PTSD, mostly veterans. They've tried everything under the sun. It hasn't worked. They're still sick. And then they experience 3 doses of MDMA and 42 hours of psychotherapy over 12 weeks. And 55% of those people are no longer meeting diagnostic criteria after having that experience, which is incredible in and of itself. Then you look at those people 1 year out with no additional treatment as administered by the study group, and that 55% number goes up to 67% with no additional administered treatment by the study group. And that is a situation that we never see in psychiatry. All of the studies of psychiatric medications show that whether you're looking at antipsychotics or SSRIs or SNRIs or any of the other medications we have, that when our patients stop taking the medication, they almost always relapse. And so this was showing the opposite, and not with daily dosing. And so that really stuck out as like a paradigm shifting opportunity for the way we look at mental health, and really brought me back to the ancient origins of medicine, going back to Hippocrates, Maimonides, and ancient Eastern and tribal techniques, where for thousands of years we have been taught that the source of healing comes from within the person seeking to be healed. So then what is the role of the healer? The role of the healer is to empower the person who is seeking to be healed to heal themselves, not to position ourselves as the source of healing, right? And so that fundamental difference in the way we practice mental health today, or medicine in general, compared to the way we and treat chronic illness, compared to the way that we treated these things in history or cross history, just created a really interesting dichotomy for me, where I was like, these two are not aligned, right? So how do we take these principles of ancient medicine, understanding, because even today in mental health training, we're still taught that the patient is a source of healing. It's not coming from us. And yet we make the mistake of assuming it comes from us, or it comes from the medicine, or it comes from the treatment program all the time. So how do we just continue to remind ourselves and remind our patients, our clients, that they are the source, and empower them to self-heal? And that's what the MDMA studies are really showing, which was so promising. And then that, through the study of how MDMA works, really led to the development of Apollo and the study of the wearable technology.
I love that. Thanks so much. And listeners should take note. If you've been around for a while, you kind of picked up on this message here. Like you have it in you. We just have to set those conditions in you so that you can heal. It's kind of very Groffian. Yeah. And I really appreciate that. And I think I even studied Moses Maimonides in my undergrad. So it's fun to hear that. Because there's so much interesting philosophy and medicine kind of paired together in history. And it was often that. It's like it's in you. I think I remember something about Keller Bush people having very specific language about, letting the medicine rise in you through their rituals, and a lot of things would resolve. Yeah. If only they had wearables, right? Like I got super addicted in kind of a negative way to my Whoop device, where I would just be like, oh shit, didn't sleep well again. I think it was about 3 months ago where it was like, I can't anymore. I can't do it. I tried so hard. And then I got the Apollo from you guys, and I was like, okay, let's try it out. See what we get. I remember using it at Meet Delic years and years ago. I liked your booth there. I got to chat with your folks there, and I think all my friends tried it out for a little bit. And I was like, you know what? I wish I had that so I could be a little bit more easy while flying, because I get like, kind of like, I'm not freaking out. Like I'm not going to get security called on me, but I'm extraordinarily uncomfortable most of the time in there. And I've been flying with it the last couple times, and I think it's really decreased my overall stress load. So I'm kind of curious, like, before we dig into Apollo more specifically, like, what were you seeing in the wearables world that kind of made you interested in kind of, starting to develop something? Was it something about somatics and vibration, or what was the influence?
So I think what I was seeing in the wearables world was the same thing that you just mentioned with your Whoop, right? Which is that people were using wearable trackers, and there's nothing wrong with wearable trackers if you need that information to teach you about yourself. But I think a lot of people already know when they're stressed out, and they know when they're not sleeping well, and they know when they're not exercising enough. So getting data back saying that you're not doing enough, you need to do more when you're already stressed out, creates data fatigue, right? And people were buying wearables. And when I say wearables, I mean buying back in this is back in like pre-2016 times. They were buying wearables, buying fitness trackers, things like that, to give them these insights into their health. But ultimately, a lot of people found after several months of using them, unless you're an extreme elite athlete that's trying to eke out every last little percent improvement you can, that there wasn't much new insight they were getting, and that they were just adding on responsibilities. And one of the things that was always stood out to me about wearables that I thought was wearable trackers that I thought was so funny was I would have patients come in and they would tell me about their sleep, and they would say, I woke up and I felt great. And then I thought I felt really rested. And I looked at my wearable tracker data, and it said I didn't sleep well last night. And then I felt terrible. And I'm like, well, isn't it more important that you felt like you slept well than that your device told you didn't? And of course, a light bulb goes off, and they're like, oh, maybe, right? And like, how much faith are we putting in this data technology? Not to say that it's not useful. Again, it is useful for certain things, just like medications are useful for certain things. But we have to make sure that you can have the best technology and use it the wrong way and not accomplish your goals. So that was really interesting to me, because the benefits of wearable technology are that they gather so much useful data about us, but they don't take the wearable trackers alone don't take the final step of actually solving the problem. They give us the information and then they say, hey, you solve the problem based on what we've assessed your problem is, right? But the action from us is still required. And if we're stressed, overwhelmed, overtired, etc., underslept, making those changes, even when you're told exactly what to do, is really, really hard, because evolutionarily, when our stress response fight or flight system is going off through the roof because of any number of things in our lives, we get tunnel vision, and new things become bringers of uncertainty and unfamiliarity. So we actually avoid new things, even though they might be healthy for us. Those new things and that change becomes really hard because our body opposes it because it's potentially uncertain. So it's easier when you're stressed out, even though it's not good for you, to go back to the Netflix and back to the Haagen-Dazs and back to the cigarettes and back to the booze and whatever it is, because that's what we find familiarity and comfort in. We cling to things we know when we're stressed and overwhelmed, and that's what our bodies have evolved to do. So I think that was a big reason why that was a big gap that we saw in the space, where we said, well, what if wearables could actually start to solve some of these problems for us? Not just tell us we have problems, but actually start to solve them. And that set off a new path to ultimately the development of Apollo, which also came from our understanding of how MDMA therapy works, which we can talk about in a minute if you like.
Yeah. So, let's actually dig right into like how are you modeling? How does MDMA psychotherapy work? Like, I'm sure you have a great way to explain it.
So when I first heard about the trial results that were coming out from MAPS that we talked about earlier, I was really excited about them, just because they were so promising. Some of and just to, 55% symptom remission or treatment remission rates going up to 67% at 1 year out, that was an unheard of statistic in psychiatry, like unheard of. We have never seen anything like that in the history of our field. So that was itself a fascinating finding. And so when I saw that, I actually really wanted to get involved, because I'm in that research, and I'm a mechanism guy as a neuroscientist, and I love to figure out how things work. And so I was told, like, you got to meet Rick Doblin, you got to find Rick and talk to him to get involved. So I went to the Horizons conference in 2016, and I met Rick in person at a fundraiser and in New York City, and we had the opportunity to chat for 20 minutes. And I said, I said, hey, Rick, like the results you're getting from these studies are just absolutely stunning. Can we figure out how MDMA works? Because if we can figure out how it works, we can come up with other tools that can help induce that effect, or even a small percentage of that effect, for people that don't require medicine, because the medicine is illegal right now. That was back in 2016. It's still illegal. It won't be legal for practice in the clinic until probably mid 2024. And it's going to be real expensive. And there's only 700 people roughly nationwide that are trained to do it. So it's going to be hard to access. And, Rick originally was a little bit skeptical and wasn't sure he cared. But then as we talked, he was like, okay, this is interesting. So he allowed me and three or four of my psychiatry colleagues to get trained in MDMA therapy. And from there, we took our research into two directions, one of which was studying the mechanism of MDMA therapy on the epigenetic level, and to see if we could start to repair some of the epigenetic changes that Rachel Yehuda and others have now shown that trauma induces in the body on cortisol receptor genes, which was a paper that was just published in this past February, that we showed in studying the MAPS phase 3 trial subjects that, yes, in fact, MDMA assisted therapy does start to repair some of these epigenetic changes that are induced by trauma, which is fascinating, and particularly fascinating because it's repairing stuff that's in the safety fear response system around cortisol and stress. And so that was kind of the stress link. And then the second part that came out of that was, when I got my MDMA training with MAPS, I learned from doing a ton of research into the animal studies of MDMA and what they had shown in the brain of mice and rats, and then combining that with what I was seeing happen in human subjects who were experiencing MDMA therapy in the MAPS trials, that MDMA works by molecularly, at least from what we can tell now, it seems to be working by molecularly amplifying safety cascades in the emotional brain. And that when you amplify safety cascades in the emotional brain, then or what we call the limbic system, that sends direct signals to the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, that says, hey, bud, we're safe. You don't need to overreact right now. You can settle down and we can enjoy this moment and be present. And by present in the MDMA therapy context with PTSD, that means safe and present enough to actually reevaluate your past traumatic experiences and reinterpret and remake meaning around them so that they don't sit with you for the rest of your life. And that's what we were seeing in these studies of the MDMA psychotherapy. And so all of this came back to and kept coming back to this concept of safety. And that our safety, our physical, mental, emotional, legal, financial, all-inclusive spiritual safety is critical to the healing process. Again, something that's been taught by Eastern and tribal practitioners and Hippocrates and Maimonides, and even Western medical training teaches that safety with our patients is the foundation of our healing relationship. And so as I started to pull on those threads around these common threads around safety, started to ask, well, what makes us feel safe naturally? What are and it's unsurprisingly soothing stuff, right? It's like the smell of your mom's chicken soup. It's a hug from a loved one. It's holding a purring cat or a pet. It's having your hand held, ocean waves washing over you, right? It's like soothing, gentle sensations. And when I started to parse those apart and look at, what those have in common, touch really rose to the surface, because soothing touch is the oldest, most powerful and quick form of safety that we have. It evolved over hundreds of millions of years since the first mammals started nursing their young, and it is hardwired into our nervous system, and to the point where it's almost immediate in effect. It is not completely nonverbal as an experience, and it requires no effort to receive it. And so as we started exploring that, we thought, well, if soothing touch is so effective at activating the safety pathways in our brains, and this is, going now, we're fast forwarding to like 2016 or 2014 through 2018 at the University of Pittsburgh. And after 2016, when I got my MDMA training, we started to pull on those threads of safety and to say, okay, maybe if trauma is a response to threat in our bodies that our body stores over time, can we treat it or address it by providing constant safety stimulation to the body over time? Because that's how MDMA seems to work. If MDMA does it in the moment that the MDMA is active, what if we give people stuff that helps them feel safe on the go, like a wearable that delivers the feelings of soothing touch to you wherever you are? Like what I'm wearing on my chest right now. And so that started with us delivering soothing vibrations that help the body achieve these breathing states that we enter when we meditate by inducing coherence, or what we call like cardiorespiratory resonance, which is what the heart and lungs do when we enter a meditative state, around 5 to 7 breaths per minute. And if we sent that rhythm to the body, would the body recognize that as safety, number one? And number two, would it change our breathing and bring us into one of those like blissful present meditative states that favors recovery rather than stress and threat? And multiple clinical trials later, that was in fact what we showed we could do, which was surprising that it worked so well, and it worked in most people. And then, fast forward to 2020, after a heck of a lot more studies and, thousands of people in the lab in the real world, that became Apollo.
So launch was in 2020, you said?
Yeah, we launched in January of 2020.
Wow. Yeah, you guys have really gone fast. I love that. Obviously, you got to go slow to go fast. So you did a lot of groundwork first. So yeah, no doubt. And yeah, that's super interesting. I guess how in your mind, how do you frame like this kind of like vibrating tool for soothing touch? Like it's obviously using your body's knowing it's getting touched, right? Like how does the vibrations from Apollo and say we're doing like the calm down, wind down mode on there, Like, how does that correlate to a loved one's touch? Like, how is the signal similar?
So the way it's in, so there's the way it's interpreted, and then there's like the way that it is acting neurologically on the nerve endings. So we have about 7 different common, most common touch receptors in our bodies that exist throughout our whole bodies. Some of them, some parts of the body have more of one kind than the other. And those touch receptors have, just like all neurons in our bodies, they have each one has a different sensitivity level. And when you receive a hug from a loved one, or you hold a purring cat, or somebody holds your hand that you like, that stimulates those receptors in a very specific way that is somewhat rhythmic. And it's similar to soothing music. It's like there's certain music that gives us energy and makes us like amped up and want to dance and party. And then there's other kinds of music that makes us want to calm down and sleep and relax. And so it was a combination of the understanding of how these different rhythms of music work to affect our body, and that by applying the basic layer of that rhythm to the body, that at the rhythm that the touch receptors like, that they feel and interpret as soothing, that is similar in nature to soothing touch, that you could activate the same emotional pathways that are activated when we're experiencing touch. So by no means is Apollo a replacement for soothing touch. It's more of a help tool for those of us, which is almost all of us, that just don't have enough touch. Like, we're all supposed to get 8 minutes of hugs a day or something like that. I don't remember the last day I got 8 minutes of hugs, right? I mean, but that is so important to just reminding us that we're safe in our own skin, and reminding us that we're in control of how we feel. And so it was really focused around that. And then heart rate variability, HRV, was the metric that we primarily tracked, because soothing touch and soothing stimulation to the body improves heart rate variability, and so does breath work and biofeedback. And so what we learned through the study of all the work that came before us was that the body actually likes to be in that state. It likes to be in this calm, soothed state, and it's just overwhelmed and overstimulated a lot of the time. And that's why it's not in that state. So then the research question was, if we deliver the rhythm that we like to breathe at, our bodies like to breathe at when they're at rest, which is like 5 to 7 breaths per minute, when we're normally breathing at 12 to 24 breaths per minute, which is stress breathing, then would the body start to automatically breathe at its ideal rhythm on its own, simply by receiving the right rhythm? Is that enough? Right? Like, if you play the right dance beat, will people start dancing on their own, or will they just sit in the chair? Right?
Sometimes.
Sometimes, but one or the other, depending on how much people like the song. But with touch, it's less subjective. And that was really interesting. And so what we were able to show through just repeated studies and trials of many, many different frequencies and patterns was that there are very specific patterns that we interpret as soothing touch. And they're, you can tell that the vibration is vibration, that somebody holding your hand is somebody holding your hand. There's no confusion there. But nervous system wise, our bodies, through our touch receptors, don't really know the difference. And both of those help us enter calm, relaxed states very, very quickly. So that was really through the repeated testing in double-blind, randomized, like placebo-controlled format and that kind of thing, where we had no idea what vibrations people were getting, and they had no idea what they were getting. And we were asking them to do lots of stressful tasks and physical and emotional tasks and cognitive tasks, and then measuring their bodies with lots of lab grade EKG, EEG, pupil assessments, and all these other things, that we could reliably induce these states of calm in the body that looked just like when somebody entered a breathing meditation technique or biofeedback, or when somebody gives you a hug. And so that was the signature we were looking to replicate, which is when HRV starts to really go up. And so when we hit that, we were like, oh, we're getting real close here. And that was how we started to distinguish between these different vibration patterns in a new way.
That's super interesting. I hope most of the listeners know a little bit about HRV. Could you give us just a super high level, like, what is HRV?
Yeah, the simple explanation of HRV is that it is the variability of our heart rate over time. So most people, it's like the difference between each beat in time. So most people think that when you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, that our heart is beating exactly 1 beat each second. But that's not actually what's happening, because as we breathe, it changes the resistance of the vessels in our lungs. And so the heart has to work harder at different times to pump. And so the time between each beat changes over time. And that's called heart rate variability. So having a low heart rate usually correlates with having a high heart rate variability. And we know that having a low resting heart rate and a high heart rate variability predicts better health outcomes, better quality of life, and less likelihood of getting sick and longer life. And we know that having a higher resting heart rate and having a lower heart rate variability, because the time in between each beat is less, it predicts people having more likelihood of getting sick, shorter lifespan, lower quality of life, and lots of other health issues, more likelihood of lots of other health issues. So that metric that you can measure just through the skin, and now with like every wearable like Apple Watch and Oura Ring and things like that, became a really nice clue for us to start to follow along the way.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was thinking about when I was at my fittest, and the only way I would have ever measured my heart rate or anything was getting hospitalized. I got hospitalized, and I was like, oh man, that's like the craziest lowest heart rate I've ever seen. And the whoop was telling me I was eminently gonna die. So I'm like, I gotta put this thing down. So happy I did. But yeah, HRV. The first person I heard about it from was Dave Asprey, as he's hyping some of his like meditation tools, which is interesting. And then I started seeing it more and more, and now it's like, thankfully, it seems to be everywhere, which is great.
Yeah. And the natural techniques that boost heart rate variability are the things that we do that slow our heart rate down. So it's getting a good night's sleep, doing deep breathing, meditation, yoga, soothing touch, soothing music, regular healthy amounts of exercise, not overtraining, because that will reduce HRV by stressing the body, but regular healthy amounts of exercise, like half an hour of getting your heart rate up every day or so, and things like that. But it's really the common theme around what increases heart rate variability is soothing sensations. And so and heart rate variability is also a reflection of how toned our vagus nerve is. So the vagus nerve is the primary nerve that governs all of the recovery response in our bodies and tells our bodies, hey, you're safe enough to recover now because you're not under threat. So let's send blood and resources back to the reproductive system and the digestive system and the immune system and our sleep and recovery system and the creativity and empathy systems, all things that we don't want to be active when we're running from a predator in the jungle, right? You don't want to empathize with your predator when you're running in the jungle. You want to get out of that situation to safety. So when we're under stress or threat, even if it's not actual survival threat, if it's just perceived threat, like from too many emails or too much traffic or what have you, all of those recovery systems get shut down and our vagus nerve decreases in activity. And so when all of those systems get shut down, and they get shut down sometimes multiple times a day, every day for years, you're effectively saying, hey, digestive system, reproductive system, immune system, I want you to keep working at the same peak level, but I'm going to deprive you of oxygen and nutrients, and I'm going to take away your garbage pickup, right? And so what happens to those organ systems? Of course they get diseased, right? They're being depleted of everything they need to function. And so that just creates this general state of inflammation in the body that a lot of the techniques we're talking about here start to help. And so Apollo was a really interesting discovery for us, because using HRV as a key, knowing that breath work and yoga and mindfulness and all of these things over time help to improve it, and good sleep helps to improve it, we thought, well, maybe if we boost HRV by providing the soothing sensation to the body, that's an indicator that people are going to be able to recover more. And when we discovered Apollo technology I guess the first discovery was like 2017 when our first study results came back. we were the first to discover it was the first technology ever discovered that improves heart rate variability, and just by wearing it. You don't have to do anything else. You can literally just strap this thing on anywhere in your body, and just wearing it throughout the day improves your vagal tone and heart rate variability. And so that was one of the first keys to solve that puzzle.
So people are going to have a couple questions for sure. So you mentioned you're doing RCTs and other really interesting research. Like your website does say you had university partnerships to like help, maintain objectivity, because obviously that's important in a commercial situation. Like, can you talk about how or who you worked with and how you worked with the universities to do research?
Yeah, absolutely. So all of the work of Apollo came out of the originally came out of the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Psychiatry. The first manuscript was published last year with elite athletes, showing that statistically significant improvement in heart rate variability in a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled crossover study, which is the most rigorous form of clinical trial, where every subject's blinded and every subject experiences all the experimental conditions. So everybody's going through every single piece of the study. And then we have 4 more publications that are coming out in the next year or so. I think three out of 4 are actually coming out of different groups at the University of Pittsburgh. We don't run one of those studies is coming out of our company, and we did it was a real world study, observational, with Apollo purchasers who were just observed in the real world. And that was a fascinating sleep study that we did, where we were just showing what happens when you add Apollo to your life, and we track you for 3 years. And we did that in 1,300 people over the last 3 years. But other than that particular sleep study, pretty much all, and which we clearly label on our website research page, all of the studies we do are with independent academic partners. So that means that neither myself nor anybody else on our team has any say in anything from the study protocol to the way the data is analyzed to whether it's published or not, and the paper writing and the conclusions. We purposefully, because of my rigorous scientific training and background, if you're going to do science, do good science, don't waste time and money. And so we went and found some of the best scientists we could, who saw a need in the patient population or in the scientific literature, a gap in the literature, and said, hey, would you be interested in studying this? We'll provide the tool and we'll provide tech support, but you do the rest. And we don't even pay for the study. Almost all these studies are investigator sponsored, and they take it the whole way themselves. And of course, the downside of that is that everything takes longer when you don't have like a huge bank account behind it. But the upside is all the research is completely genuine, and it's 100% independent and unbiased, because the people who are running it are independent academic scientists, and they don't care if it's positive or not. They just want to do good work. So that is the science philosophy of our business, which is, as you alluded to, a little bit different than most other companies that produce product. But for us, we'd be making way more money if I was just seeing patients and my wife was doing her thing, not running a startup. So we really had to prove to ourselves before we started this business that this actually was a real effect, before we devoted our lives to it, because running a startup is no joke.
It's not always fun. Yeah, made me need an Apollo. So I think it's interesting. I wonder, I have been seeing slow improvements over time too, over the last 4 weeks. Is it Apollo or not? N of 1. How do I know without being part of an actual trial, right? Or even me, it's irrelevant what happens for me in a trial. So, well, that's really interesting. So I guess next up, you're starting to get integrated into ketamine-assisted psychotherapy research, and also some portions of the integration for after an MDMA session. Is that right? Can you tell me a little bit about your active projects?
Yeah, so we've had about 7 trials completed to date. As I said, 4 of those are going to be published in the next year or so. And then we have 14 more clinical trials currently underway. 2 of the studies that I'm most excited about are in the psychedelic space, because Apollo came out of the psychedelic space, and our work with veterans with treatment-resistant PTSD. So it's really nice to be able to come full circle back to that. And one of the things, we took another step in the process of developing the technology that most companies don't take, which was after we did our initial early double-blinded RCTs in the lab, that's great results, but it's, 25 up to 25% improvement in cognitive performance, like 11% improvements in heart rate variability, really great results. However, those are not real world studies. So we wanted to know what happens in the real world when people are using this. Does it have the same effect? Because that's not always the case. And so my wife, Catherine, who is now the CEO of Apollo, had a great idea, which was let me get you some money from the university, and let's make prototypes that are wearable. And let's distribute those to thousands of people before we actually go all in making a commercial product. And let's make sure that this actually works with real people in the real world. So we did. And that started in about 2018. And we learned so much from those thousands of people that were using this. The first thing we learned was that people used Apollo for sleep. And in our studies in the lab, we only tested it for focus. We didn't do any sleep studies originally. We only tested Apollo for focus and cognitive performance and stress. We didn't look at it for sleep. But when we gave it to people in the real world, people are like, oh, this helps me sleep better. And they were sending us sleep data showing like sometimes in the first 4 weeks, 2 to 4 weeks of using it, like double or triple their deep sleep and increasing their sleep at night by half an hour, 45 minutes. I mean, it was like big numbers as they were tracking them by their own wearable technology. And so that really had a dramatic impact on shifting our focus of the company to one where, of course, the field of medicine is also shifting to recognizing that sleep is at the foundation of health, of course, and especially mental health. But that was not fully embraced at that time. And we shifted the product to sleep to sleep as a focus because sleep is our most physically vulnerable state. And so that it's when we're basically defenseless, right? Like our whole protective system is offline. And for us to be able to enter the most vulnerable states of sleep, like deep and REM sleep, where we're sometimes paralyzed physically, we have to feel safe. So that was really interesting. And then the second thing that was really interesting was people were reaching out to us saying they were using Apollo with psychedelic medicines. And the two things that came up from that were, number one, three things. Number one, this helped me drop into my psychedelic states more effectively. It reduced my anxiety going in, and I had a much better time. Number two was it helped. I was having a bad trip, or I was having a really hard time in the psychedelic experience with anything from ayahuasca to LSD to psilocybin, what have you, and that it helped them navigate that challenging experience. They were actually able to move through the discomfort of the bad trip or the challenging trip and come out the other side on their own, feeling whole and not feeling re-traumatized, which was fascinating because I see in my practice people who have bad trips that re-traumatize themselves all the time, which is a very real thing. And then the third was I use this during my after psychedelic period, and it helped me to integrate all the stuff that I learned from my psychedelic experience. So from that, and these were all healthy people for the most part, not people who had a diagnosis. And so from that, we did two things. Number one, we released Apollo in 2020 as a consumer product, not a medical device. It's built as a medical device, so it's medical device powered, but an equivalent quality, but it's a consumer product that requires no prescription and anyone can use it and buy it over the counter, which made it more accessible to everybody because we had no side effects in any of our trials, and it was found to be universally safe in our studies and in studies of these vibrations in the past, that the few that had existed. And then the second thing was that we started seeing clinicians in the ketamine therapy space using it because it was not a medical device. And so in ketamine therapy, anxiety is a big problem. People who have anxiety coming into a ketamine therapy experience feel or have a much harder time dropping in to their experiences because they resist the discomfort of the change, of the state change. And then they require higher doses of medicine, which either gets them there but decreases their memory of the experience, because ketamine at higher doses starts to have memory impairment in the short term. So people have an experience, but they're like, I don't really remember what happened, but it felt nice. And then, so we started seeing clinicians using Apollo with their patients, and they were giving it to them in the waiting room before they actually went in for their ketamine, just for 15 or 30 minutes. And that was enough to help them drop in and require and just reduce enough their apprehension anxiety so that they had more of a meaningful experience with less dose of medicine. And that was fascinating. So now there's been hundreds of patients, fast forward to 2023, where we are sitting today, right? We've now had hundreds of patients nationwide being treated with Apollo plus ketamine in the real world, and actually seeing really great results from before, during, and after for integration. And as these results started to come in, and as we started to get more results from our PTSD pilot studies, I was speaking at a conference with Rick Doblin again, and we were paneling together, and I was talking to Rick and sharing some of our data with him from these PTSD pilots. And he was like, he's holding the device. He's like, this can't hurt you, right? And I'm like, no, like, we haven't seen any side effects, just sound waves. And he's like, that's really interesting. If you're getting these results as good as you're getting in a PTSD population without drugs, what if we just gave this to everybody who went through our MDMA trials? And I was like, that's a really interesting idea. So we started to work on that together, and started a collaboration with MAPS. And I think it was about a year ago, we got an IRB approval for administering Apollo to any person who's ever been in an MDMA trial for PTSD, an MDMA trial for any indication with MAPS. So as maybe an interesting call for action, if anybody's listening to this and interested in participating, this trial is open and recruiting right now. And if anybody has ever participated in an MDMA trial with MAPS at any time period, you are eligible for a free Apollo to participate in this study. And you can go to our website, you can sign up and just fill out the screening questionnaire. And if you screen in and you're able to participate, we will just send you a device and we'll track your data over the next 2 years, and to understand if we can help increase your remission rates, decrease your symptoms over time, and improve your recovery response after MDMA as an integration tool. So that's been a really exciting study. It's not going to be done for a couple of years, but it's a really exciting study to see what the potential is to combine, the science of touch therapy and wearable technology with psychedelic assisted therapy. Because my hunch is that by putting the two together, what we're going to see in the clinical trials, what we're seeing in the real world, which is that these are synergistic combinations, right? The sum of the two is bigger than each individual part, and that people are going to have combined better effects from the combination than from any one part individually, because we know how important integration is.
I love that. And I'm very excited to see what the data says. And that's unfortunately 2 years out or something. We'll get there. We should last that long. And then
there will be other studies that come up sooner. We're doing a study, a small group study with Pam Kriskow we're involved in the Roots to Thrive study, where Apollo it's actually a fascinating study that Pam has set up. She's a psychiatrist in British Columbia. And she's doing some of the first group therapy studies with ketamine and psilocybin for first responders with PTSD, and with medicine with and without Apollo. And so we'll see how that works in the group setting. And that will probably be published before the MDMA trial plus Apollo. So that'll be an interesting one to keep a lookout for. And then, the idea will be eventually we'll do more ketamine trials as well, because it's much, much easier in today's world to study ketamine than it is to study anything else psychedelic. So lots of exciting stuff to come.
I love that. A topic that comes up for us here on occasion is one that doesn't get a lot of attention in psychedelia. It's HPPD. So like hallucination persistent perception disorder, something along those lines. Maybe I switched the P's around, but like, have you seen anybody come forward with any kind of anecdotal data around HPPD yet?
I have not seen any studies of that.
Okay.
I see people. So what I may not be getting this exactly right because I haven't used that term before and heard that used much. But what we call that, or at least what I know, as I understand it, the way we describe that in the clinic is drug-induced psychosis, and it's where people will have a psychedelic experience with a medicine, and then the psychedelic phenomena and the hallucinations persist afterwards for an extended period of time, to the point where there can even be like depersonalization and derealization effects, and people can lose sense of who they are, which
Hmm.
can be completely disruptive and result in not even being able to function in your day-to-day life anymore. And I see a lot of this in my practice because there are very, very few people nationwide who actually treat this. But the good news is there are treatments for it. And a lot of it involves just gentle, a lot of it involves intensive psychotherapy, talk therapy, to integrate the experience. Integration is key there. And then also mood stabilization with natural substances for the most part, and tools like Apollo. But it's a really good question that you brought up, because it's something that happens. We know it happens, but there's not a lot of conversation about it, or what to do about it right now.
Yeah. Thanks for that. It's kind of similar to cluster headaches. It's like a somewhat orphan disease because it's so rare, but it can happen. And there's a vocal minority out there that, they're raising the sound bells. And we've looked at, how could we intervene? We have some theories, and I'm glad you're doing some stuff there. So you'll be getting some extra referrals, fortunately or unfortunately. Um, but yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just saying, like, it's just great to know that you're thinking about it and active there a bit.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic to me. I'm always interested in the stuff that nobody else is looking at. But I think that there's something worth talking about here, which is the word hallucination,
Oh yeah.
because I'm not a huge fan of that word. There are certainly times where the experiences we have in and out of a psychedelic state can be considered to be hallucinatory. But but the word hallucination implies that what you're experiencing is not real. And I hesitate to use that word in the context of psychedelic work, because psychedelic means to reveal the mind. And so if we put out the understanding that what the revelation of what's underneath the surface of our consciousness and our minds is not real or hallucinatory, then we might be missing a lot of the meaning of what's actually underneath the surface. And what the way I like to think of, and it's not to say that doesn't happen sometimes, of course it does, like the purple dragons and the rainbows you might see all the time may not actually be there. It might be a way that light's reflecting, that our retinas are detecting, that's different than that's chemically induced, right? That's different than the way our retinas normally work, and that might be considered a hallucination. However, there's a lot of things that happen in the psychedelic experience that are not hallucinatory and that are in fact real perception. And the way that happens, and again, there's a lot to be understood here. We don't have all the answers by any means, but when you look underneath the surface of your consciousness, it's almost like, if you think about it from the perspective of an iceberg, right? Our awareness in any normal given day is like just the tip of the iceberg that's sticking out of the water. That's all we have the awareness of, because there's 100 million more pounds of iceberg underneath the surface. But if we were aware of all of that at all times, we'd be completely overwhelmed and distracted and not be able to function. So our brains have very highly trained filtration mechanisms that are neurons in certain specific layers of the brain that are specifically trained to filter out all the rest of that iceberg beneath the surface. When you take a psychedelic medicine, or when you enter a deep meditative state, or in a dream, for instance, which is the most common way that people experience any kind of, I would argue, any kind of psychedelic mind revealing experience, you're all of a sudden able to look beneath the surface of the water and recognize, hey, look, there's all these other parts of this iceberg down here. maybe some of these parts are important, and then we can investigate them and dive in. And maybe certain other parts aren't important or aren't relevant right now. And I think that that's an important distinguishing factor, because we don't want to derealize the experience too much or devalue the experience and just blanketly call it, oh, hallucination, it's not real. There's a lot of real valuable stuff down there. And it's really, that's why, again, integration is so important, because the integration therapy, what happens after the psychedelic experience, is that time where we have people who are highly trained to help us understand what was real and meaningful, and what was maybe an artifact of the drug-based experience, or an artifact of my experience that could be considered a hallucination. And so it's sometimes, even to the best of us, it can be really challenging to interpret what's what. So thinking about it from that standpoint is important, because there's a lot there's a lot going on underneath the surface. It's literally everything is down there. Everything that we're aware of is just the tip of the iceberg. Everything down beneath is everything else. So there's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of healing that comes from structured experiences where we're safe enough to actually look beneath the surface and parse out what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Wholeheartedly agree, and thank you for that. Yeah, it's I've seen very few psychiatrists bring that up, so I appreciate it. I think my friend Franklin King has brought it up a few times, and I'm thankful whenever anybody tries to tease that apart a little bit. And I think I've only hallucinated a couple of times. It's not exactly a common phenomenon for me, even at pretty high doses. So yeah, and HPPD, I know plenty, at least a couple people who have had that experience, and it's not fun. It's to be avoided if we can figure it out. So that's why I think psychotherapy and having integration practices in place ahead of time is definitely a good move for most folks, even if you're just recreating. Get that psychotherapy ahead of time, please.
Yeah, and also have long breaks between your altered state experiences that are drug induced, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's great to meditate every day, or great to practice natural techniques to get to psychedelic states every day, right? It doesn't require drugs to get there. But when we're doing the drug-based experience, even with our patients, we have long breaks in between so that people don't struggle with confusing real from drug-induced altered state, right? Mm-hmm. They're both valuable experiences, but we need to have enough perspective to understand what's what.
Agreed. Yeah. In the Groff world, we call that confusing inner and outer realities, which can get ugly. Yeah. And I'm sure it happens quite often in clinical spaces here too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. That's why we urge the eye shapes, but not everybody loves them. Anyway, was there anything we missed about Apollo, about yourself, that we want to fit in?
I mean, there's so much to talk about. Well, I think one thing that's really interesting that we touched on a little bit earlier is going back to this epigenetic story, right? And really understanding the root mechanism of what's happening when we experience a profoundly safe healing experience that allows us to effectively feel safe enough to heal. And that study that we published in collaboration with MAPS and Rachel Yehuda at Sinai and Dr. Kamendi at Yale, Candace Lewis at ASU, and Rael Khan at USC, Joe Tafur. It was a very interesting study because it really starts to shed light on what's happening underneath the surface in our cells when we are experiencing healing. And to tap on that a little more, what Rachel Yehuda and now which has been replicated in animal models, demonstrated in her studies of Holocaust survivors, is that trauma induces changes to our stress response genes like cortisol receptor on the epigenetic level that changes the functioning of our cortisol receptors in a way that can get passed down to our offspring. Right? So going back to this idea of intergenerational inheritance of trauma, we inherit trauma through our epigenetic code and the way that trauma shapes our stress response in the form of what we might call epigenetic memory. And then also all the way, we learn trauma from our environment, from being exposed to traumatic experiences. And what's interesting is that people and animals who have these epigenetic changes that are trauma induced on these cortisol receptors, for instance, have an increased predisposition or likelihood to develop mental illnesses like PTSD. So they are actually very important biomarkers of illness. And so what we were trying to show was, if trauma, which is like one or multiple intense, meaningful, threatening or experiences that are perceived as threat over time, for which we were not adequately supported afterwards, causes these changes to cortisol gene expression that predicts an increased likelihood of developing PTSD, as one example, then how could MDMA work with just 3 doses to repair that? Well, MDMA is kind of like a reverse trauma by that definition, right? It's one in the MAPS trial, it's 3 doses, 12 weeks of psychotherapy. It's one or multiple intense, meaningful, safe experiences that are challenging, but after which we are supported very tightly and held. And in a lot of ways that makes you think, well, and at least it made us think, that if that treatment with MDMA therapy is able to clinically reverse the symptoms of PTSD in these people who have such severe illness, perhaps we could track it on the cortisol receptor genes, right? Perhaps it's actually changing the epigenetic memory. And if it changes the epigenetic memory, would it stop us from passing that predisposition down to our offspring, right? So that study was a study we published in February that was just really exciting, that shows that, yes, in fact, the first part of that is true. We don't yet know about the passing down to offspring after the fixing part, but we know that MDMA therapy now from that study, looking at MAPS participants in the phase 3 trial, have a repairing or a remodeling of their methylation epigenetic patterns on that same cortisol receptor site that were changes induced by the trauma, or that have been shown to be induced by traumatic events. That this is starting to change our epigenetic code. And what's even more interesting is that the amount of epigenetic change at that cortisol receptor site is directly proportionate to the amount of clinical outcome. So wow. there's a linear relationship between how our epigenetic memory is recorded and how much it's recorded on cortisol receptor genes. There's probably lots of other genes involved, don't get me wrong, but this is the one that comes to the surface, and how much we get better. And so this really brings us back to the safety pathway and this understanding of, cortisol is a stress response gene. It's a stress response hormone. So it's involved in how we interpret safety and threat in our bodies. And so going back to that theory of how we developed Apollo and how safety is important, we had the pleasure of working with the Denver VA to actually replicate this study with Apollo alone, which is targeting the safety pathway through the skin. And they've been giving Apollo to veterans with PTSD for a 12-week period, no drugs, no MDMA, just giving them Apollo and using Apollo to target the safety pathway. And we're collecting their samples before and after their 12 weeks to see if, by chance, will targeting the safety pathway in a different way than MDMA change the same or have a similar effect on the cortisol receptor site? And will that also correlate with amount of clinical improvement? And if we can show that, and it may not be shown in this study, there'll be a lot more to come, because one study often isn't enough to get to the end goal of proving your hypothesis. But If we are able to show that other safety-based treatments, whether it's MDMA or traditional ceremonial ayahuasca or other things, or ketamine therapy or Apollo or soothing touch, if any of these things are inducing similar changes to cortisol receptors that we saw in that MDMA trial, then we know it's not the drug that is inducing the healing state, right? It's the safety that is amplified by the drug that produces the healing response. And that will be really, really helpful to us as a field to understand what we actually need to heal. I think the theory is we need to feel safe enough to heal. This would actually prove that, which would be so exciting.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. All right. I'm feeling similarly mind blown to the last time we chatted. So I'm thinking we're going to have to do more. So,
Anytime.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So where can people learn more about Apollo?
You can learn more about Apollo at apolloneuro.com. That's APOLLONEURO.com. And if that's too hard to remember, you can go to wearablehugs.com, which is what the kids call it. And if you want to find me, I'm at drdave.io. And you could find me at Dr. David Rabin on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm always happy to hear from you. So please do reach out. And if you want to learn more of a deep dive about any of these topics, that especially the last few topics that we've been talking about, check out my podcast, the Psychedelic News Show, which is called The Psychedelic Report. We deep dive into this particular epigenetic study with Candace Lewis, who is the first author on that paper that just came out in episode 24. And then I just released a special feature called that's co-produced by the Psychedelic Report called Your Brain Explained, where we deep dive into the trial results and what they mean around the MDMA trials. And then we just released an episode with Gabor Mate and Rachel Yehuda deep diving into the mechanism of trauma and trauma healing.
I love it. Dr. Dave, thanks so much for being here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to more.
Likewise. Thanks again for having me.